I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry that this is the only slide with Russian subtitles. I just copied it from the program. The others are mainly pictures. How did they know early dating methods and its implications for contemporary archaeology? I have chosen this title to point out to the two aims of my paper. First, how did they know, respectively, did they know, is the part in which I want to ask what kind of knowledge archaeologists of the 19th century had about relative dating, especially about stratigraphy. What kind of knowledge did they have? Where did it come from? And how did it develop? In the end, and this is the second part of the title, I want to show possible implications for contemporary archaeology. I will focus on the question how recent research can deal with results obtained with early approaches to relative dating. Let me start with a quote from the year 1865. The archaeologist is free to follow the methods which have been so successfully pursued in geology, the rude bone and stone implements of bygone ages being to the one what the remains of the extinct animals are to the other. In this early statement, John Lubbock, an English banker and politician with interests in biology, paleontology, and archaeology, reveals the well-known roots of relative dating in archaeology. Natural sciences were of vital importance in the 19th century, and scholars as Lubbock often engaged in various fields, including earth history, history of humanity, and biology. Lubbock wrote books on the mountains of Switzerland as well as on the behavior of insects. Thus, numerous approaches to archaeology were inspired by developments in geology and biology of that time, and methods of relative dating developed from sedimentology and biological classification. Stratigraphy and classification have remained important for archaeological research ever since. Today's concept of archaeological stratification and classification reject the analogy of geological layer models and evolutionary progression of artifact types. The reasons are obvious. Geological stratification is regular. Layers, which are mostly consolidated, can be correlated over wide areas, mainly by the objects embedded in the layers. However, since these objects are fossils, preserved organisms, they have each undergone determined biological developments and can thus be classified precisely. In contrast, the objects of archaeology are artifacts. They are man-made and they neither develop in evolutionary processes as species nor in continuous life cycles as individuals. Contrary to fossils, archaeological objects are therefore inapplicable. They cannot be used for the precise identification of layers. In respect to chronology today, it is thus important that the content of archaeological layers is subordinate to their sequential arrangement. In geological context, objects date layers. In archaeological context, layers should date objects. But for early stratigraphic approaches, the geological layer model was crucial, as were the methods of biology. In simple terms, archaeological layers were believed to pile up horizontally one after another. And artifact types often were supposed to evolve like organisms, linearly with historical continuity. Both sets of assumptions guided, of course, the early archaeological research. In the beginning of the 17th century, stone and metal artifacts were most important for archaeological dating. Christian Jürgensen Thomsen, we already heard about him today, from the National Museum of Copenhagen, developed the 3-age system. The first chronology directly based on their observation of artifacts, their provenience, and their association, how they lay together. Around 1840, his colleague Jens Jakob Vosser, we have already been hearing about him, applied and confirmed Thomson's system in fieldwork. During excavation of various burial mounds. However, in the second half of the 19th century, weapons and tools were increasingly questioned as sufficient elements for dating, since they did not allow a more subtle, a more fine periodization. Several archaeologists identified pottery. I think I forgot one. Yeah. Several archaeologists identified pottery as a more appropriate tool for relative dating. And this was due to its short life period and to the frequency of its occurrence. So it was everywhere in archaeological sites of all kinds and not as metal artifacts, mainly in graves. In tell settlement archaeology, excavators like Heinrich Schliemann and William Flinders Petrie, we already heard about Petrie. No, we did not hear about Petrie yet, became most famous for their dating approaches by pottery. Schliemann has been singled out as the excavator who already in 1874 put artifacts in order by linking them with layers in the settlement. However, Schliemann actually recorded mainly the depth of in which he found the pottery or small finds. So here you see he recorded the depth next to the particular object. Obviously, he was convinced that objects found in the same depth originated from the same layer. Thus, he derived the layers from the depth of particular findings, rather than assigning artifacts to particular layers. In a way, he thus made up the layers by looking at the depth of the objects. In 1890, Flinders Petrie used a self-established sequence of pottery for dating the settlement of Tel el-Hasi in Palestine, where he was excavating. Based on the depth of the layers containing the particular pottery and several known absolute dates, he derived an average interval of 650 years as equivalent to 32.5 feet, which equal about 10 meters. And by applying this method, I don't know if you can see it, he to the entire height of the settlement mound, he calculated a beginning of the settlement activities around 1670 BC. These are surely two of the most extraordinary examples of periodization with accordingly wild results. Petrie based his concept on typological aspects without any stratigraphical observation, while Schliemann created layers according to the position of the objects he found. An inspection of earlier excavations on tell settlements by the German archaeologist Rudolf Echt has brought to light the difficulties of separating empirical and speculative aspects in stratigraphic work. Speculative aspects, as for examples, the assumptions Petrie and Schliemann have worked upon. However, it is obvious that Petrie and Schliemann both already applied the idea of translating space into time to the particular archaeological site. Translating space into time I took from the book that was already mentioned by Wolfram Scheer by Gavin Lucas about time in archaeology. So they both already had, they already applied this idea. Also, other fields of archaeological research had varying stratigraphic approaches, for example, excavations of settlement and graves in Europe. Thus, in the course of the 19th century, excavators often recognized the differing depth of particular artifacts or the superposition of archaeological features. However, there was no stratigraphic methodology applied. Observations of stratigraphic successions were only arbitrary and did not underlie a scientific agenda. In addition, stratigraphic approaches were not necessarily linked to chronology. In the late 19th century, German excavators were quite concerned with the responsible way of excavating prehistoric burial mounds. Which method would reveal better results? Was it appropriate to dig a trench, or to start from the top, or to excavate the barrow in vertical parts? In the last 2 decades of the 19th century, more and more excavators advocated what was by then called the layer method. Using the layer method meant removing the earth in horizontal layers. Among German barrow diggers, the layer method was soon considered the most scientific manner of excavating a barrow, and it was applied most frequently in the beginning of the 20th century. However, there was neither a consistent definition of the layers that were involved in that work in that method, nor did the different excavators give an identical argument for the use of this method. A curator of one of the German provinces, called Karl Kohausen, recommended in 1873 to remove the inner part of a burial mound successively by layers of about 30 centimeters. Kohausen was sure that this method, I quote, will provide us with a clear picture of the grave's layout. End of quote. Another excavator, Otto Tischler, working on burial mounds in the 19th century East Prussia, also declared the removal of earth in horizontal layers to be the preferable method. So, he said, so all stone constructions are clearly brought to light and remain visible through to the end. So both excavators aimed at attaining a particular perspective on the features on the grave in the mound, and therefore removed the earth in layers of a more or less regular thickness. Yet another excavator, an art historian called Friedrich Klopfleisch, also recommended excavating in layers, but suggested to lift layers not of specific or arbitrary thickness, but of historical relevance. Klopfleisch was less interested in the structure of individual burials. He was interested in them, but this was not his argument for excavating in layers, he was more interested in chronological information. In 1887, he explained, excavating in layers means removing each individual layer of earth in succession, removing the layers of the barrow in reverse order to that in which they were once erected. Thus, unlike his two colleagues, Klopfleisch insisted that the soil should be removed in anthropogenic layers, in quasi-historical sequences. Thus, he tried to rewind the historical process of building up the mound. He was presumably the first one in German prehistory to conduct stratigraphic excavation. He gave meticulous instructions on how this had to be done. Klopfleisch's main objective was to record the stratigraphic situation in numerous burial mounds and to record the sherds, the pottery sherds, in the observed layers, and thus to gain a system of relative chronology based on stratigraphy. I will now lead over to the second part of my title and ask, in the end, what implications these developments of the 19th century have for today's archaeology. I showed with a few examples that there was no successive development of the stratigraphic idea, but a search for chronology on the one hand and for appropriate excavation methods on the other hand. And the implications I will look at are such. Recent archaeology still deals with excavations results from 19th and early 20th century. To be able to evaluate and to judge these results for further research, it is important to be sure of the particular starting point of the former excavators. Particular research interests always affected the approach to stratification. To understand how early excavators obtained their results, it is therefore necessary to distinguish the definition of stratigraphic units or layer and their stratigraphic method as follows. A stratigraphic unit could be identified by typological characteristics of embedded artifacts, understood as a feature of defined consistent homogeneous material, as an ash layer, for example, or defined by historical functional criteria, as in the early 20th century was invented the definition of construction phases as stratigraphical units. For the analysis of research methods, the following approaches to archaeological stratification can be distinguished. Firstly, stratigraphic observation on site. Secondly, stratigraphic analysis subsequent to fieldwork, so after excavation. Thirdly, an active approach to stratigraphy, that is, stratigraphic excavation. So in dealing with chronological sequences obtained in early archaeology, or with results from particular excavations of the 19th and early 20th century, we should be aware of the set of assumptions the archaeologists then were dealing with. Thank you for your attention.